Okay, welcome back to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 85. This week, we're going to be covering This Week in Macro, and that involves the main focus on everything that's happening this week in macro, plus the escalation in what I call the US destabilization campaign. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in UK, it is now happening in the US, and I want you to be prepared, but I want you to follow the money and understand what is actually happening, because in the headlines, they're not going to tell you. So we're going to start with the main things that were happening this week in the macro environment, and then we'll get through to the US destabilization campaign, how to interpret it, how to protect yourself. And in part 3, we're going to be doing This Week in Geopolitics, which is all about what is happening right now as we record, a regime change operation with Israel doing strikes on Iran, what it means, what comes next, and what they're not telling you. Okay, so this week in macro, I mean, I guess we could start with, Trump's trying to make some announcements around US and China. It's going to take ages for these things to be resolved, but he's getting very keen to make an announcement. And so basically, it was announced that US and China will hold trade talks in London. They had those talks this week. That didn't involve Trump and Xi Jinping themselves. It involved their relative representatives meeting within London, and there is ongoing conversations, and that will take a long time to figure out exactly what they're going to be doing there. But immediately, Trump wanted to boast, and I'll read out what he says. We are getting a total of 55% tariffs, and China is getting 10%. But we are getting, what this essentially means when he says we are getting, so basically he's saying we're doing a deal, everything's great, we're winning, they're getting 10%, we're getting 55%. But what this actually means, we are getting, really means that we are paying. So if they got to pay, then that really means that this tax hike means that Chinese goods will be 55% more expensive for Americans who buy them. And remember, China doesn't need to buy American goods. America does need to buy Chinese goods because there are parts of that chain that can't be broken, which is what we saw. Now, if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I believe the tariff policy was a complete farce. It was a strategy done by BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network in order to redistribute the world into a multipolar world order. Just like COVID sends small to medium-sized companies within America, consolidate them up into the larger multinational corporations. Same with the export-driven as the second impact. So those companies can be vulture capitalized by the private sector that wants to acquire those distressed companies as a result of these tariffs and drive the world into this multipolar world order that BlackRock's invested in, because it is invested in a global. And we're seeing more and more of that, what we call repatriation trade, which is where capital is exiting the dollar. It is then being converted into their local currency and then invested in their own local money market or stock market in order to boost and repatriate money out, which is in turn weakening the dollar and accentuating the effect as well. Now, as a result of what happened yesterday, and I was up all night giving commentary on this. If you follow me on X Spaces, I'll probably be returning to that because this campaign is live right now. But immediately when the escalation happened, where Israel started striking inside Iran, immediately that was met with oil going up 15% at its peak. It has come back down a bit, I think it will calm down. But Trump does not want the price of oil to go up, and so that starts to play into the dynamics of the geopolitical section and what comes next. Interestingly, in the strikes, I'll cover more of it in the geopolitical section. But there has so far been no strikes on oil infrastructure within Iran. And they did not want this to impact oil prices too highly. So the infrastructure at the time of this recording, I'm not sure if that has changed right now, but there have been no strikes upon oil infrastructure within Iran. Right. Now, remember the little bit of the farce. So we talked, last week about the whole Musk thing, Epstein thing, Palantir thing, Trump thing. You can go watch that if you didn't watch it. But they officially went to the House in order to pass some of these Department of Government Efficiency Doge cuts. And if you remember, I said the dollar is debt. America can't pay down its debt. If it pays down its debt, it triggers a depression, a deflationary cycle, a credit contraction, and therefore it will either have to have a monetary reform, because you can't fix that with a tax reform like tariffs, or it has to pivot away from that. And it looks like at the moment it is pivoting away, because tariffs has already had the desired impact of splitting the world into the multinational world order. I'll cover more about that in the geopolitical section. And Doge needs to stimulate, because the government needs to spend in order to get that GDP print. So then they can back all of this debt by stable coins in order to roll over the Ponzi scheme further. And it looks like they weren't able to achieve much of the cuts. In fact, it was so bad that they came in to get approval of slashing, wait for it, $9.3 billion from USAID, NPR, and PBS, which are the deep state operations, which fund much of the, things like funding militia groups, and some of the things that gives America its soft power abroad that they seem to be cutting back upon, like USAID, all of the criminal activities with the black op money that happens by funneling money through to these operations. They only managed to get $9.3 billion. So those operations still continue and the money hasn't been saved. So as a result, what happened? Well, Trump is now raging a kind of destabilization campaign, or a public argument on the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, in these debt spirals, they can only control the short-term interest rate. The market is controlling the 10 and 30-year bond rate, which is going up. It's corrected a little bit once the dollar has been having this volatility. But you should be watching the yield on the 10-year bond, the yield on the 30-year bond, and DXY, the value of the dollar as it decreases. Now, immediately, he's been coming out and looking for the Fed to do a 100-point basis point Fed interest rate cut. What this means is that is the short-term rate. It's not the long-term rate. The Fed can't control the long-term rate because the market doesn't believe what's happening, as the credit rating is getting worse for America and has been downgraded. And so on the short-term rate, the Federal Reserve is able to do stuff, but the inflation numbers were improving. It was slightly worse, but it was almost as expected. So the CPI, Consumer Price Index, came out at approximately 2.4%. So that doesn't allow for an environment of cutting these interest rates. And so Trump is trying to accelerate that and demanding that it does a rate cut and add some rocket fuel to the market, which is translated as the exact opposite of everything he promised the American people. This is not rebuilding the manufacturing base. This is not doing the tariff trade. This is not, this is about getting back to Bidenomics and, quite frankly, what you have to do, because the dollar is a debt-based Ponzi scheme and you can't pay down the debt, which is why Elon ended up going off in frustration. Either it was a farce or he knew that, but, there's no way of doing that without creating the impact. So he wants some rocket fuel, which means wealth inequality. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Transfer of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, the opposite of everything the campaign promised was due. And so there was a lot of rhetoric around Trump saying he's going to be announcing the next Fed chairperson very soon. And in order to have impact over the Federal Reserve, which is essentially a proxy for the banks, and the banks are way more in control of both the Federal Reserve and the government, because government are subordinate to corporate within America, UK, EU, and that hemisphere. He's kind of making this whole concept of what we're calling a shadow Fed chair, which is essentially what we had with Janet Yellen, where you have under Biden, where you have the Treasury Secretary that has a role within the Treasury side, which is the fiscal, the government, and then they move across to the Federal Reserve and they can enact the policy of Treasury for the Federal Reserve. Basically remove some of that independence, even though it's meant to be there. But we all know who's calling the shots. It's the banks that own the shares in the Federal Reserve. Anyway, we've got this concept of a shadow Fed chair because Trump hinted that he would look to appoint Scott Bessent as the Fed chair. Scott Bessent, which is the one that worked for George Soros when we were crashing the pound, with the euro introduction, that essentially is a hedge fund raider that is now the Treasury Secretary that may end up becoming the Fed chair of the Federal Reserve in order to enact the policy. And you can bet your better than dollar, what would be the strategy? Well, how about combining Treasury and Fed and ending up doing a stablecoin form of quantitative easing, where essentially the banksters or the stablecoin issuers, rather than the Treasury issuing that currency direct, they issue a stablecoin, back it by selling these new bonds, and then the stablecoin issuers receive all the yield from issuing stablecoin. Who are they? Trump himself, Howard Lutnick himself, all of the different stablecoin issuers that are essentially benefiting the worse the government debt gets with the higher yield by backing those stable coins as we roll over the Ponzi scheme and you move towards it. And then what do? You issue it to everybody, combine it with Palantir or the social credit score, and now you've got your stable coin quantitative easing with guaranteed adoption into a new technocratic programmable money controlled by the technocracies and those that are in the Trump administration for the loss during this transition. So remember, your job is to understand this, follow the money, and make sure that you're getting on the right side of it rather than being the one that they are bag holding to you, selling you all the shit treasury companies rather than owning Bitcoin. You are minimizing your stablecoin exposure and recognizing that much of this is to try and extract as much Bitcoin from you so that they can create a pump and dump and all sorts of market manipulation by the proof of weapons network as we transition to the final iteration of this debt-based Ponzi scheme that is designed to steal money from the average American person over to those that own assets. And what is the ultimate assets when you're transferring to this multipolar world order? Well, it is a neutral asset. What is a neutral asset? Gold, Bitcoin. One is digital, one is physical. And in the digital era, you want some Bitcoin, and you should, I believe, I can't give you financial advice, everybody should own more Bitcoin this month than previous month. Do what they are doing. Those that control the Federal Reserve, those that control Treasury, those that control the government, the BlackRocks, the Proof of Weapons Network, with BlackRock as CEO, that owns 20,000, has seats on 20,000 different companies and manages over $11 trillion. They're getting all their clients into Bitcoin, and they want you to own your Bitcoin through their ETF so they can control it. And their banks can end up using it in order to put it on their balance sheet so they can issue stable coins so that they can then back it by Bitcoin so that they can margin call and steal your Bitcoin rather than eventually when the hedge funds manipulate it, rather than you just exiting the system and owning it in self-custody. And what are the central banks doing? The central banks are exiting the amount of dollar reserves that they have. And now the amount of gold that they're holding is going up and up and up. We're getting more and more of these bond auctions. And we'll keep watching these bond auctions as they're trying to roll over the $10 trillion of debt that the Trump administration needs to roll over. But now gold is going up in terms of central banks owning gold as a reserve, as some of them are selling down their dollar reserves. Others started to sell down some of their euro reserves, and now gold superseded the euro, even though it is strengthening relative to the dollar in this repatriation trade that we talked about. But now gold is the second largest reserve asset for central banks, and it has now passed the euro, which took the second place before. So they are doing what I'm saying. They are owning more Bitcoin, but through gold in central bank world, a hard asset that is not even as hard as Bitcoin, because gold has an average of a 2% increase in supply every year, whereas Bitcoin is under 2% right now, but it's a fixed supply of 21 million, and there's only another million left to mine. And there is more than enough demand from these treasury companies and various other people that are buying Bitcoin more and more. It is a race to accumulate the Bitcoin, hold the Bitcoin, and put it in self-custody so you don't get on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network that now wants your Bitcoin in these macro trades. So during this Iran strike, interestingly, we hit almost new all-time highs with Bitcoin this week. It went up to about 111,000 approximately, and then corrected down to 104K because Bitcoin is a leading indicator when markets are closed, and most of the escalation happens when most of the major market were closed. We had that oil 15%, it came back a little bit, but it gives you an indication, and we had some market corrections as well today as well. At the same time, based upon this, prior to the Israel-Iran strikes, we had the dollar, which DXY, which is the index of about 6 currencies priced in dollar. Now, there's two things when you're dealing with currencies. There is devaluation, which means your purchasing power, and the dollar has lost approximately 99%, if not more, of its purchasing power. That is different to relative strength. And that's what DXY measures. It measures the dollar, but priced in another currency. Now, what I encourage everybody to do to get the truth, whenever you're looking at a chart or pricing something, you should price it where the denominator is in Bitcoin or gold. And you will find all assets are losing. Real estate, bonds, stocks over the long term relative to gold and Bitcoin. You'll be very surprised about the performance. It takes out the illusion of pricing things in dollars, where things look like they're going up, but it was actually a strengthening dollar. Now, as the dollar is weakening, you have those that have foreign assets. Essentially, they're losing money on currency as they're losing money on assets, and so this is what causes them to want to sell their assets and end up selling their dollar assets so they can buy their own currency so they can reinvest in their own. And so we've had the dollar below the $100 psychological mark, and it went below $98. This is a new record low after essentially a 14-year bull market in the previous 14 years. Now, when the Iran strike and Israel strikes happened, we've had a bounce above. It came back a little bit, but it's still below, and it's just above the $98. Make sure you keep watching that. DXY is what you should be watching in order to see this repatriation trade of capital flowing out. Now, what is the proof of weapons network doing? So the proof of weapons network, I always call it, I've covered it. If you watch previous videos where I've said understanding the proof of weapons network, I described how it is this stateless entity that sits above government that is able to, in a more decentralized network, but with no accountability, control government, control all these different forces, and use various other things in order to manufacture portfolio management. Now, what do they benefit from? Such volatility in the dollar makes them a lot of money. So while getting all of these hedge fund trades, these venture capital trades, they're getting all the volatility trades as well. And so, volatility and the dollar weakening is they don't give a damn. They're going to make money out of that as well, the hedge funds as well. And so essentially, this is hyper accelerating the effect by using the derivatives market, when the proof of weapons network, which knows and has technology and signals that it can put out there that all money managers are using, it will be engaging in essentially currency warfare at the same time, which is Scott Bessent's speciality and why he worked for people like George Soros and his funds. And essentially, because the proof of weapons network is global in nature, it can utilize any of these weaknesses in the currencies in order to get ahead of any of the investments when it's reallocating people's capital. And so they basically get to wage warfare against their own dollar, the host nation in US, where these companies are all public as well. And they get to profit off the dollar's fall at the same time as other divisions of the proof of weapons network, like say the Morgan Stanleys of the world, they get to basically sell and hedge for all of their clients as well. So they can either capitalize on the market swings as they choose, because they have no connection or tied to the dollar. That's not their game. Their game is simply to profit at all expense. And the government used to be able to represent their people, but now the government is subordinate because you can buy your politicians through lobby, through this proof of weapons network, where the government no longer represents the people anymore. So now you have these perverse structures where the proof of weapons network can control capital outflows as it pre-invests in the different regions. And you can look at the corporate, the companies, and you can see basically where next wars will be by reading the types of contracts that the proof of weapons network is getting, which is kind of what's been leading to a lot of my analysis as I've been sharing it as well. Basically, the dollar stability is somebody else's problem, but whose problem is it when the government and the Fed are subordinate to the same banks and financial institutions? The banks are the shareholders in the Fed that have the lobby money in order to lobby the government, and therefore they can have fiscal and monetary policy and they can engineer the game, and they are way more powerful because they have $10 trillion of the government's debt, the private banks, and then you've got the central bank as well. And so those that are the beneficiary of the debt, those that are underneath it are subordinate to it, which is why you have this proof of weapons network where essentially there is strategic campaigns to work against the American people, against the European people, against the British people, in order to maximize profits while governments deliver those agendas. And where is this? What do you do at the end of it? That's where stable coins come in. They do two things. One, they allow you to roll over the debt so that the government never repays the debt, as Doge apparently tried to do. Probably just a data play into Palantir in this technology. But at the same time, you get the programmable money and you transfer the profits from issuing the dollar over to the technology companies that get to roll over the Ponzi scheme as well. While companies like Morgan Stanley, they essentially get to push all of their clients into pivoting their investments. And so that's why I follow many of these types of managed funds and the types of disclosures you can get around where that money is moving. That tells you way more than listening to what politicians tell you or listening to media as well. Rather than just scrambling to hedge all of these things, they can get ahead of it and they can shift capital to Europe, for example. And so we saw the euro increase relative to the dollar, but Europe is in distress because it's gone through a destabilization campaign. The Russian war and the escalation in Ukraine was about vassalizing all of the land into BlackRock that was issuing the loans, using nodes like Keir Starmer in the UK in order to collateralize the debt, using the UK economy so it can no longer invest in doing what governments are meant to do. And then you can push the narrative in order to extend the war rather than focus on negotiating peace. And therefore, you can then use this in order to squeeze more currency as the dollar weakens over to euros, and then you can use that in order to basically squeeze out pension funds so that pensioners get the short end of the tail. They get to outperform it for profit. And then BlackRock can then do distress loans on many of these distressed companies. This is why the destabilization campaign exists. You can get these predatory. Why? Because these are public companies that need to meet quarterly returns, and therefore they focus on short-term profits. And now the government is subordinate to them. The governments no longer work for the people, which is why you're getting much of this civil unrest. But an example of that, you saw that this week on the micro side rather than just the macro, where essentially water in the UK through companies like Thames Water has been privatized, and now it's privatized. You can then use this exact same structure of strengthening the pound, borrowing against that while you're executing this, and then you can strategically use those derivatives to weaken assets and purchase them in distress, and then you can push out those assets and not focus on the quality of the water, for example. And this is a classic example of how privatization leads to these perverse structures where you end up with water not being optimized for how it's meant to represent the people, and you can profit from this. And you can basically get distressed assets and strip out those assets by basically launching destabilization campaigns on the governments that you control. And that is exactly what we're seeing. So I know that you are led to believe that the Trump administration right now is doing mass deportations. Let me, aside from Republican, Democrat, communism, capitalism, left, right, the emotion of what you're told everything is that most people focus on, step outside. And in the last section of this, I just want to help you understand how the proof of weapons network, which is fiat currency, and at the moment, the largest money manager, BlackRock, is essentially what I call the CEO of the proof of weapons network, can utilize government policy, privatizations, and end up with this wealth redistribution that creates more and more civil unrest campaigns. And we're starting to see this in full force. So whenever I see something on TV, I don't listen to the media. I don't listen to what the politicians are saying. I try to follow the money and understand the commercials behind it so that I can understand why is this happening when most people can't figure it out. Okay, I believe that right now, Los Angeles is on the front line of a destabilization campaign, just like we saw in UK and we saw in Europe, and we saw that many times. The end result in UK was that there was mass arrests, people were shut down from protesting, and their phones were confiscated, and you ended up with this mass surveillance state from everybody staying at home, trying to avoid the violence, and begging the government to control it by ushering in a next wave of command and control technology ready for the transition to stablecoins and central bank digital currency. So here's the playbook as I see it. And again, I'm just following the monetary trends. You decide whether you think this is feasible. But I don't believe that what you're seeing in LA right now was about illegal immigration. Now, there are some people that genuinely join protests. There are others that engage in looting, and then there are others that are deliberately, systematically paid in order to be agents of chaos. And then you subdivert and you film those people, and you end up with these crazy images of a Mexican guy with a mask on, waving the Mexican flag on a cross that looks like a Hollywood movie, in order to manufacture outrage, spread it across social media. Anybody that's still watching legacy media, they get to watch it, and you just get outrage and outrage and outrage until you end up begging for law changes, just like we saw after 9/11 with Patriot Act, that type of thing. It is an operation that is funded, and I believe by constituents of the proof of weapons network. The war on terror was a classic example. An operation by the deep state, by CIA, which is controlled by military that sits and, government sits underneath. Remember my layer 3 structure. I said you've got the central bank and the asset managers. Then underneath that, you have the intelligence agencies, which is for representing corporate interest and some country interest. And then underneath, you have governments that represent corporate interest through lobby and monetary transactions. Then underneath that, you have the people. And so you can manufacture a war on terror by essentially engaging in an operation like an inside job to take down 9/11, manufacture a narrative like we need to have weapons of mass destruction, and then the military side of the operation can earn a load of money and trillions of dollars. You print the money, you pay for the inflation, and they're asset managing these operations that then leads to confiscation of gold in Iraq, for example, or confiscation of oil in Syria, for example, and various other things that is done through USAID and some of these covert and overt wars that I've covered in the past. The best book to understand this is read Operation Gladio by Paul Williams, if you want to understand how this structure was set up and the concept of this. But anyway, you can create these war on terror types of narratives. It is essentially a test zone by the proof of weapons network for the latest narrative. And this is Trump. This is a multi-uni-party, everyone thinks is bipartisan. It doesn't matter who's in charge. The mission still continues. It's basically a model of violence that is basically monetized. So there is a business model behind the violence. It is algorithmically triggered. So you get data from the technology in order to use this technology in order to determine how to, manufacture these types of campaigns. And it is basically regionally scaled. So you can just then wash, rinse, and repeat. And if it gets bad enough in one region, you can trigger being able to use the media in order to get a wider civil unrest campaign in order to meet a wider strategic goal. As I said, UK and EU were the beta tests. We saw this, for example, Mossad and CIA, and MI6, they implemented paying agents like Tommy Robinson connected to Israel, created hate campaigns that led to civil unrest and an uprising from people that are being subjected to these atrocity propaganda. We see it time and time again. Once you know the pattern, you'll recognize it, these Operation Gladio types of things. Now, this is multi-party, as I said. This is not just something that's happening right now. This is something that is built up over time. The Biden administration was essentially used in order to give you open borders. That was the open border phase. That leads to a narrative that was used by the Trump administration. And the Trump administration, and again, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, these people do not care. And I'm not talking about government. I'm talking about the proof of weapons network. They do not care about humans. They do not care about your well-off. And the government is subordinate to them. So you can't trust politicians because they need their money, which is how it works. But the Trump administration is now being used essentially to deliver mass deportations. That was the campaign. We've got the invaders, we've got the criminals, and whether there's truth to the narrative or not, you've got manufacturing fear and civil unrest so that when the deportations happen, you can have essentially what they always used to do when they would regime change a country like Venezuela or Syria or Libya or the other 100 campaigns in El Salvador or Honduras or South Africa or Sudan or Somalia, the ones that America has done time and time again for the military industrial complex. There's a book called Covert Regime Change, if you want to learn more about this, where you can see just operation after operation, and it's still happening to this day. Well, what they used to do is they would take protests and then they would install agents into those protests, and they would use those agents to, quite frankly, just shoot in the middle of a protest, kill people, And then that would create the rage that's needed to turn a normal protest into violence. And then they could use that in order to regime change and overthrow a government. I believe that there is a campaign right now happening as we speak in Iran that I'm going to cover in the geopolitical section. But Trump is the mass deportation phase. And so once you combine those narratives together, you start getting people to get more nationalistic, to get more racially, when people are on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network, they're crippled in debt. They did everything they were told. They had operations like COVID that got them injected. They ended up with lockdowns, mentally ill, mentally distressed. We got people that are record suicide rates, record mental disorders, record drug addictions, the lowest birth rates because people have got addictions galore. Once you're in that state and you're not getting a job, and then you see a narrative around foreigners come in, an invasion, you're going to get mad. And that is the type of campaign that you're seeing. And then you get those that came in that will start protesting, join those protests, and then you can create the types of things. Now, both of these have their own profit model. And those models are essentially using government in order to basically, the government gets fake GDP. By fake GDP, you get to print money at the Federal Reserve level. You get to have something like the One Big Beautiful Bill. You get to use campaigns to scare people into approving those. You put all sorts of things in there, and then you get a bunch of money, which costs the average American that doesn't have assets inflation. And then that money is siphoned off to the corporate contractors that get subsidies from government, and the corporate contractors get all of the money, and then they get to reinvest those in assets. And when you reinvest those in assets, you beat everybody that's in inflation, and you have this rich-poor divide that brews up into civil unrest when you have all the assets over a long-term period controlled by fewer and fewer people. And then the people stuck on debt on the left saying, why is the system broken? And begging the government and getting angrier and angrier and angrier. The government gets the fake GDP to make it look like they're growing. The government takes on all of the debt, which means more dollars are created. You have something that looks closer and closer to, the government being bigger and bigger. So now I think in America it's about 30% of GDP. And then that is controlled by the corporations that sit on top, and they get all the benefit from that. And then you get this illusion of growth. And people get less and less productive, and that leads to the tensions that you're seeing right now. But essentially, both of the narratives of open borders and mass deportations, they're two sides of the same coin that taps into different narratives. And the goal is always, at the end of this, having seen this done in Germany, done in UK, done in various other parts of Europe, the end result is a surveillance state and more draconian law changes that take away and move you closer and closer and closer to, this full technocracy that we're getting closer to. Now, the American people that I speak to, they say, don't worry, I've got my First Amendment. I've got my freedom of speech. What's happening with that freedom of speech? We're talking on X, we're going on Spaces. We're feeding the algorithm, which is the data that's going to be used by Elon Musk and various others to create the social credit score that will be integrated with the stable coins. And so you can see how this is fed into it. We have no choice because we have to engage in artificial intelligence. And that's why I want everybody to be building their Bitcoin stack so that we can have decentralized money, decentralized artificial intelligence, decentralized data, identity. This is how we fight back. That's not going to be done through your First Amendment, because now it's going to be feeding the algorithm. Freedom of speech equals more data to be weaponized and put into organizations like Palantir, that in this big, beautiful bill is asking for all of that data to be consolidated into a private public corporation, where the share price is going through the roof and you are funding your own removal of your First Amendment. And then they say, well, no. If this gets too bad, I'm going to get guns, the Second Amendment. And so what will happen when you use your Second Amendment, you fight back and you resist against the system, that will be met by the technology that's been beta tested in Gaza. They will call you a terrorist by taking away those laws using the Patriot Act. If you resist, you protest, you debate. And so while you might be cheering all this along because you don't agree with some of the political views of some people protesting right now, next it's you. And those drones are starting to be used and beta tested in Ukraine. And so is it really extreme that the same technology, that the same corporations that don't give a shit about humans, that have created genocide as a service and occupation as a service, might use that same technology against you when you try to protest with your Second Amendment? And so this is what I believe is happening in California. And this is what was a launch pad when you recognize the pattern that they'll use against you. Essentially, what they're doing is they're bringing basically tech, these technology, military industrial complex, these various factions of the proof of weapons network. And they're using that same technology that they've been using in Gaza and Ukraine, and basically creating a privatized, even prison model, which is the American model. So if you are detained, those private corporations that can lobby, they get paid for every detainment. And then if you get deported, then they've got a new model that Trump set up with those countries that are vassalized into IMF loans, that are trying to free themselves with Bitcoin, but didn't accumulate enough Bitcoin, and so therefore had to take the IMF loan and therefore have to bow down to the proof of weapons network, like El Salvador. And so El Salvador has now created the privatized prison model using the same corporations that profit from every single detainee, and you end up with the same type of perverse incentives. And this is the type of thing that we're seeing right now, which is why, of all the countries in the world, the so-called beacon of freedom, the land of the free, has more people in prison, a higher rate of imprisonments than any country in the world. And a deep state that profits off raging wars around the world in order to control the resources to get drugs into the country, which is still done at state-sponsored level, despite the through this deep state partnerships between military, CIA, and the mafias and cartels that are in this, and so what are we seeing right now? Well, essentially, the violent colonial model that Europe, UK, US used in the Middle East, in Latin America, in the global South in general, in Asia regions, that led to having these military bases all around the world, that very same model is turning inwards and being used because the government no longer works for you, because we've got these global institutions, is being used to destabilize the host countries. And you can profit from these currency trades, as I said, as you manipulate these different types of campaigns. This is exactly what we saw in UK and EU. This is why I left the UK. This is why Bitcoin gave me the economic freedom to be able to get outside of these psyops, so that I could give you the content, and hopefully you can do the same as well, if you keep those consistent good habits. Basically, the empire is cannibalizing on its own. And people in America, they criticize UK and EU, but we're seeing the same thing being done. So what comes next when you have these destabilization campaigns, this model that profits, you call in ICE. So ICE is told that they're enforcing immigration law to you, but there's nothing lawful about it. Just like the strikes that Israel was doing in Iran, there is nothing lawful about that. They're just going in. They call it a premeditated strike or something, or trying to get ahead of it, whatever the words or the legal jargon is. Anyway, basically, ICE is paid for every single arrest. They're also paid for every single deportation. It is a business model. Every single arrest equals a paycheck. Every single deportation equals a dividend. And so you can follow the money and you can understand why these models are happening. Basically, there is a privatized prison model. And so therefore, you want to scale that model. You scale that model by having more and more prisons and partnering with the companies that are addicted to your IMF dollar debt. And they're getting vassalized as you weaken the dollar, and they're trying to repatriate their assets. And so this global network makes sure that they're able to profit from it as well. These are basically prison cartels. What I want you to do is be aware of the corporations, so that when you're if you're a share investor and you're investing in index, maybe go out of those index and go into more individual corporations, and you can boycott the ones that you don't want to support. And so, there's companies like Geo Group that's involved in this, or Core Civic. And these are the types of companies. But anyway, this is what I think the end result is. Now, while we've got the first model in LA, I think it's a beta test, and you see more and more of these things. And I want you to recognize the pattern. As we transition to this world of AI that takes your jobs, CBDCs that end up programmable money with the privatized version through stablecoins. And this is why I want you to protect yourself with Bitcoin as much as you can. Essentially, you end up with the Magnificent Seven companies. That's the big tech companies, the Googles, the Apples, the ones that are building and benefiting from this AI structure, building the robotics and artificial intelligence. They're just essentially getting bigger and bigger and bigger and owning more and more control of the government, which is why there's this whole multipolar world order that we're switching to. They end up controlling the surveillance. The MIC, the military industrial complex, they basically control the enforcement and the deep state and the intelligence for all of the black op operations. They use foreign jurisdictions and militias like ISIS, Al Qaeda, Israel, and various other things in order to do the illegal stuff that you don't want to do at home. You wash it through USAID, and then the money comes back to the corporate contractors. And that's the model which is serving the interest of this greater state. When things get really crazy, like it is in Ukraine, you end up with the distressed debt and the distressed acquisitions of all of the key resources. And that's where BlackRock and Blackstone in the venture capital in the private side, they get to manage the transfer of the capital investments in order to do these types of operations, which are maximizing the value of their portfolio based upon their extreme power in the proof of weapons network. Now, what do you get at the end of it? You get a technocratic social credit score integrated into a stable coin. And what do you need in order to get there? You need a campaign that begs you to approve the bill that has all of the technology and the subsidies for that technology, which is one big, beautiful bill, which is currently being rushed through to print over $1 trillion that contains contracts to Palantir that's going to be taking all of the data that was essentially collected through Doge, that was collected through all these different health records, bank records, all of this different stuff. I covered all this last week in the Elon, Palantir, Epstein, Trump side, if you didn't watch that last week. And basically merge it all together, which is all included in the big, beautiful bill that is going to the next stage of approval. And Senate are going through it right now. They want to build the infrastructure for essentially the same occupation as a service that was used in the Middle East for their own people through these prison states and this technology. Everything is AI powered raids in the future of this whole thing. You can have indefinite detentions. That's what's happening in El Salvador. Essentially, you go in there indefinitely. The family can't visit. Some of the claims is that this is not just being done on illegal criminal immigrants. This is being done on civilians as well, as some of the things that we're starting to see. And then that leads to massive fear and everybody begging to be protected from the unrest that comes from that as well. And I think this model is going to be scaled out, in essentially this regional power technocracy that America is becoming subordinate to the proof of weapons network. Algorithmic facial recognition and targeting, that's exactly what we saw in Gaza, that was being used through different technologies. And the basically elimination of due process. That's exactly what we saw that led to the resistance in Gaza, when essentially Palestinians were all being detained with no due process because they just call them a terrorist. And once you call them a terrorist, there's no due process and you just end up in there. You see how this works. You see why they are manufacturing all these hate campaigns, racial campaigns, religious campaigns, spreading misinformation to manufacture rage so that you can opt into the same thing that is covered in this big, beautiful bill. This is basically real-time surveillance. And I think that LA is kind of Operation One. And we shall see, and I'll keep tracking this in future episodes. But I think the next phase is not just deportations for illegal immigrants. I think you'll be targeting just poor people in general. It will be able to do ethnic cleansing, racial recognition through this technology. Protesters, you just call them, introduce new laws. You're being anti-Semitic, therefore you're a terrorist. You're a Hamas supporter. You're gone. And I think that they'll be doing it on citizens and non-citizens. I don't think it would just be the illegal immigrants. And this is ushering in the campaign because governments are subordinated to this power structure. And it's kind of a modern version, a neo version of slavery as homeland security. The final goal, as I said, is to make you beg for Palantir's technology and some of the BlackRock portfolio companies, the very same companies that people are buying that are going up in share prices as all of these things happen. Look at the prison companies, look at Palantir, look at the surveillance companies. They're going up in share price as things get more and more violent. And you'll be begging to restore order. And what do? They pay influencers. So you can see the coordinated influencers across X. People like Laura Loomer, that basically part of it. Their job is to say, right, manufacture all of the hate against Muslim people, the hate against anti-Semitism, and then use all of that in order to say, right, now we need to bring in Palantir. We need to use it on them. We need to deport more people. And they're using it on you. That's exactly what happened with the Patriot Act. That's exactly what Snowden revealed to us in his revelations. And that's exactly what documents were leaked through WikiLeaks when Julian Assange tried to do it. And that's why they ended up getting their freedom with Bitcoin so that they could fight against the system that was being weaponized against them. And I want you to follow the same model. And that's what I think we're seeing in the geopolitical side as well. I'll cover more of that when we get to part 3. But essentially their job, these influencers, is to make surveillance cool again. Create fear, push narratives. Then they'll tell you that you need this for safety, and then you can use it to crush dissent. Again, don't see this as me trying to say this is just about Trump. This is bipartisan. They want to distract you into thinking that changing the politician and changing the party is what happens, but that's the distraction as well. If Trump stops being profitable to the proof of weapons network, he gets to make money in loads of these deals. And if he's not making money for them and wrapping it up in a MAGA narrative to make you feel good about it, then he's expendable too. You can change it. It's a business model. And this is how it works. it's just like what we saw. These ISIS like a militia group, just like ISIS and Al Qaeda, which are used in order to create empire as a service and make you think that you're fighting against something when you're actually just being fooled by your own intelligence agencies and your own deep state. Anyway, this is how everything's kind of combining as we transition to this world of AI, Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, the Bitcoin topic, the macro topic, the topic, the geopolitics topic. They're all coming together and it's becoming more and more important. And so I will keep doing this every week to make sure this is the end of part 2. But I want to also leave you with solutions. Bitcoin is the resistance. By saving in Bitcoin rather than doing it in the proof of weapons network, you get to use proof of work, which is the resistance. And every dollar saved in Bitcoin is a dollar that doesn't support the Federal Reserve System. If you hold it in self-custody, you get to boycott the proof of weapons network rather than hold it with companies like BlackRock, which essentially is the CEO of the whole thing right now. Recognize that your First Amendment is probably going to be used to build your social credit score. And then your Second Amendment, if you fall for it, will be used to put you in jail and end up with some of these deportations for profit types of things. They're saying it's illegal immigrants so that they can later get the legal precedent that's needed by manufacturing it and then using it against you. That's why I want you to build as much sovereignty. I had someone in the comment section that always lost because I always say sovereignty. Apparently it's sovereignty. So if you're the person that always has that comments, you'll be proud of me. Shout out to you. I do read the comments. Please put comments below if you're watching on YouTube. We're going to be going through this together, as I said. And this is why it's important to not just think these things that are happening around the world, they got nothing to do with me. It's all connected now. It's a global world. And the same things that you tolerate happening to them may be happening to you. And I'll always make sure that you're following the money and looking at that. So that's the macro picture that we are experiencing right now. And so far in part 1, we covered everything that happened this week in Bitcoin. In part 2, we did everything that happened this week in macro and how that ties into the US and LA civil unrest campaigns. We've now got part 3. And in part 3, I'm going to be going through this week in geopolitics. And I want to follow the money. And then I'll tell you what I think I got wrong and what I think I got right in terms of my forecasts, what happened in the Israel strikes on Iran that are happening right now. So things may have changed while I'm going live. That's how fast things are moving. But I'm going to be covering all of that in part 3. It is completely different to, I believe, how it is being portrayed to you. And I want to make sure that you understand it because now you know the techniques that are being used in these wars that you don't think affect you are now being used and weaponized against you. So understand the tactics so you can recognize it when it happens to you. Okay. A quick break. I'm going to have a little bit of water. What I'd love for you to do is help me get to 100K subscribers. If you enjoy this content, please share it. If you're watching the live, we'll break this up into 3 videos. You can share the relevant video that you'd like to share with your friends, with your family. You can put the comments below, or you can watch the whole thing. And this live recording will be on my YouTube channel. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers. We are very close, and then YouTube will review it. If after that review, I end up getting censored or taken down for any reason, I'll be on Rumble. So follow me on Rumble as a backup. If Rumble takes us down, I've also got it all backed up on simondixon.com. Join the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Get yourself a login. I've got all sorts of additional goodies for you. And it will also mean that you join my newsletter so I can keep you up to date with everything as it happens. So that is everything for this week in macro in part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 85, US destabilization campaign. And in part 3, we're going to be covering the Iran escalations and the essentially the campaign that we're seeing right now that I believe we could frame as a regime change. So do that right now. I'm just going to take a bit of water and we'll jump straight into part 3.